Welcome to the Country Watch Political Intelligence Briefing Quick Hits, a weekly briefing of hot stories across the world in brief. I'm Denise Youngblood Coleman, the Chief Editorial Officer and Senior International Affairs Analyst at Country Watch. This week, the featured countries are Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. With Russia building up its military forces on the border with Ukraine since late 2021, there were concerns from NATO countries in the West about a possible invasion of Ukraine in the offing. NATO leader Jens Stoltenberg made clear that there would be consequences if Russia launched a military assault on Ukraine. As well, the G7 nations of the world vowed massive consequences if an invasion of Ukraine took place. Undeterred by these warnings of consequences, Russia appeared to continue to build up forces on the border with Ukraine. According to Reuters News, in late December, satellite images captured by a private United States company, Maxar Technologies, showed that Russia was still building up its forces in annexed Crimea and near Ukraine in December of 2021. The satellite images appear to depict a base in Crimea, Crimea being a region that Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014, stacked with tanks and other armored vehicles. Only a few months earlier, in October of 2021, that very base was described as half empty. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said Moscow was defending its security. As well, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that while Moscow preferred to avoid a conflict, it was intent on achieving an immediate response from NATO countries as regards security guarantees. Ultimately, the objective for Russia is to prevent Ukraine from becoming a NATO member. That was Moscow's red line, as it were. But the United States and its NATO allies have emphasized that Russia would not have a veto over Ukraine's desire to be part of NATO. United States President Joe Biden, in talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin, has offered a two-path plan to address the crisis on the Ukrainian border. One option, on one hand, entailed a diplomatic path forward headed towards de-escalation. The second option was focused on deterrence. It would entail harsh sanctions and increased NATO activity in Eastern Europe should Russia violate the territorial integrity of Ukraine once again. But little progress was made following the strategic security dialogue between the United States and Russia on January 10th of 2022. While neither Washington, D.C. nor Moscow cast the meeting as a failure, neither did either side indicate any progress on the pressing issue of Russia's military buildup on the border with Ukraine. United States Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman cast the talks as being frank and forthright discussions, but said it was not what you would call a negotiation. Her Russian counterpart, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, said no progress had been made on the central demand for limiting NATO expansion. Russia has continued to insist that NATO limit its military deployments in Eastern Europe and limits its expansion to include other countries, most especially Ukraine. NATO has already rejected this proposal outright and insisted that Ukraine's ambitions to join NATO not be held hostage by Russia. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Sherman has reiterated this stance, saying that no one would be allowed to shut NATO's open door policy. Following those talks in Geneva would be the meeting between Russia and NATO, as well as the meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Moving east to Central Asia, Russian and other CSTO troops have been invited to stabilize Kazakhstan following violent protests early this year, 2022. At issue for protesters was the spike in fuel prices. Yet according to the president, Jomart Tokayev, the government was faced with an attempted coup. Taking a hardline approach in his crackdown on those he viewed as terrorists, President Tokayev soon issued a shoot-to-kill order against the protesters. Ultimately, approximately 170 people were killed in the violence and up to 100,000 others were arrested. The president also appealed to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO I mentioned earlier, a military alliance of Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan for assistance. In response, Russian and other CSTO troops would be deployed to Kazakhstan to ensure President Tokayev's lock on power. The precise action of CSTO forces on the ground was in fact unknown due to the internet blackout and prohibitions on international journalists from entering the country to report on the unfolding crisis. The catalyst for protesters was the spike in fuel prices. However, there also appeared to be a broader political tenor to the protests in a country still under the shadow of Tokayev's predecessor, Nursultan Nazarbayev. Protesters' demands included the full resignation of the government, the immediate release of political prisoners, the creation of a provisional government, and a withdrawal from alliances with Russia. In fact, the outcome of the protests would be a strengthening of the alliances with Russia, as exemplified by the influx of 2,500 troops from Russia and other CSTO countries to Kazakhstan. While the CSTO troops were scheduled to depart Kazakhstan by January 23, 2022, the result was clear. Tokayev had used the protests and the influx of foreign troops to consolidate his power and sideline his predecessor, Nazarbayev. The former president had resigned from the presidency in 2019 after 3 decades in office. Still, he wielded political strength and influence as the chairman of the National Security Council. Now, however, Tokayev had removed Nazarbayev from that post, claiming it for himself and augmenting his own strongman grip on power. The intervention of CSTO forces in Kazakhstan has thus brought broader implications for the region. Viewed as the Russian satellite counterpart to NATO, it was apparent that the CSTO role was to shore up autocratic governments in Eastern Europe and Central Asia facing unrest and uprising. Moving further east to Hong Kong, there's been a crackdown on pro-democracy media companies. In the last month, at least 2 pro-democracy media companies in Hong Kong, Stand News and Citizen News, were compelled to shut their doors after police raided their offices, arrested several employees and seized property. At issue was a national security law that was passed in Hong Kong in 2020 by the Chinese government in Beijing. The legislation curtailed independent news reporting in Hong Kong, while also resulting in the arrest of journalists and political activists under the aegis of that law. The national security law has been criticized for being a means to suppress democratic freedoms and silence dissent in Hong Kong, even though democratic rights and freedoms have been guaranteed for 50 years under the Basic Law from the time the territory passed from British to Chinese rule in 1997. The media crackdown occurred around the time of the legislative elections in Hong Kong. Of significance was the fact that several pro-democracy candidates were banned from contesting these elections. Also in the region in Southeast Asia, the ousted leader of Burma, also known as Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, has been sentenced to prison in 2 cases. In one case, she was found guilty of inciting dissent and breaking COVID rules and sentenced to prison. Suu Kyi faced other charges, 11 in total, all of them regarded by the international community as both politically motivated and unjust, and intended to suffocate freedom in Burma, also known as Myanmar, and to remove the country's iconic leader from the political field. The head of the United Nations Human Rights Agency, Michelle Bachelet, condemned the sham trial and warned that it would only intensify the world's rejection of the coup that took place in November 2020. In January of 2022, Suu Kyi was found guilty of being in possession of walkie-talkies. The next case Suu Kyi would face involved corruption and violation of the Official Secrets Act. The charges against her, all with inevitable guilty verdicts, are intended to remove her from the realm of politics for the rest of her life, clearing the way for the military junta to maintain its grip on power. Staying in East Asia, I'm also covering North Korea's test of a hypersonic missile. This event would mark the 3rd time North Korea tested a hypersonic gliding missile to date. The first hypersonic missile test of a Hwasong-8 ensued in September of 2021. The second one took place earlier in January 2022. This 3rd hypersonic missile test was intended to showcase the country's advances in the military technology realm. These missile tests are in violation of multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions and came at a time when the United Nations Security Council was set to consider North Korea's weapons program. Moving across the world to the Americas, a former Colombian military officer was charged in the United States in connection with the July 2021 assassination of Haitian President Jovenel Moise. According to the United States Department of Justice, a complaint was filed accusing Mr. Palacios, as well as 20 other individuals of Colombian or dual Haitian-American background, of conspiracy conspiracy to commit murder or kidnapping outside the United States. Look out for more about these and other stories, as well as coverage about the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the pernicious spread of the Omicron variant in the future. I'll also be doing a special election report, including a retrospective of the major 2021 elections and marking the crucial elections to look out for in 2022. Thank you for your time, have a great day, and remember now more than ever, we live in an interconnected world.